For most of my life, I've been described with a word that people tend to deploy with a polite smile, but also a raised eyebrow. And that word is weird. I've been labeled weird so consistently that I decided to coin the term weird pedagogy to explore the neuro and social sciences to support my position that the weirdos are the bestos. The word weird often appears when someone violates an unspoken norm. Like, imagine walking into a grocery store at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday with a full tuxedo on. Nothing about that outfit is inherently inappropriate, but people will still stare and maybe even whisper that you're weird. The reaction isn't about the clothing itself. The reaction is about violating an invisible expectation, because in the grocery store, we have a dress code of neutrality. Don't come in here in your formal wear. Don't come in here in your pajamas. We're going for athleisure out here in the co-op. If somebody orders breakfast for dinner, people will absolutely say, breakfast for dinner? That's weird. Pancakes themselves are perfectly normal food, but it violates the time of day convention, which is purely cultural. Thanks a lot, Henry Ford. Here's one that I'm really guilty for. I love doing this to people. You run into somebody, right? And they go, hey, how are you? And you actually give them an answer. You could say, honestly, I'm struggling with some existential dread and goddamn it, my back hurts. And people will freeze. I didn't do anything wrong. You asked me, how are you? I told you how I am. And then we get into the norms around identity and expression. A man painting his nails, somebody dressing in a way that doesn't neatly map onto your ideas of masculinity and femininity. None of these things are objectively strange behaviors, and humans have expressed diverse gender and sexuality in diverse ways across cultures for thousands of years. But because a local social environment may have narrow expectations about how gender should look, deviation gets labeled as weird, and then I can't go to the mechanic shop with the nail on. But there's an interesting transition between when something becomes mainstream enough that it starts becoming cool and chic and not weird anymore. If we think of people having beards, that used to be associated with rebellion and counterculture in certain times. Now, a beard is completely mainstream. I'm not even a hipster for having a beard anymore. I'm just some guy. Tattoos, colored hair, piercings, all of these things used to represent somebody who wasn't professional, but now they're practically just a regular part of the aesthetic culture for adulthood. The color red used to be associated with men because it was blood and hunting, and blue used to represent femininity because that represented a caretaking role, and things shift back and forth from one extreme to the other. That's just how things go. So weird often tells you less about the person being labeled and more about the boundaries of the group who are doing the labeling, okay? It's a signal that somebody has stepped outside the invisible rubric. The annoying part about all of this is a lot of progress comes from people who ignore these invisible rules long enough to explore alternatives. And from the perspective of our nervous systems, novelty and deviation are exactly the kind of signals that grab attention. Our brains evolved to notice when something doesn't fit a pattern. So the same mechanism is at play here, between pattern recognition being a part of our evolutionary biology, and that same mechanism is responsible for labeling something as weird because it has moved outside of the expected pattern. Oof. And that's where today's episode begins. We're going to explore a few ideas that will complicate the notion of normal and weird. In chapter 1, we're going to talk about biology, how all of our brains are not equally positioned, and everybody has different neurological starting points that are shaped by a bunch of things that we'll talk about. In chapter 2, we'll explore why certain kinds of eccentricity get celebrated while other kinds of deviations get what? Punished. That was a good sound. In chapter 3, we're gonna go back to where it all begins, at the playground, because that's where it's decided whose behavior is visionary and whose behavior is disruptive. And finally, at the end, we're going to talk about what equity might mean if we stopped thinking about it as an accommodation and started treating it like design. My goal in this episode is to make the labels of weird and normal feel a little suspicious for you, okay? And in order to do this, we have to acknowledge something that a lot of folks either cannot or do not admit. There is no single way of being, and the moment that you can accept that truth, the entire architecture of your world starts changing. Let's get into it. Detox starts now. And this is the second time I'm filming because I had an existential crisis and crashed out the first time I tried to film it. Chapter 1, Norms are neurological assumptions. Norms are social rules that get treated oftentimes like common sense expectations about how the world should look and sound. And most of them feel really natural, and they rarely appear as design decisions at all. But they are built upon a hidden set of neurological assumptions about how our brains are supposed to function. Every brain carries a unique developmental history shaped by things like genetics, stress, sleep, nutrition. And this means that learning occurs in the systems that have already been shaped by thousands of prior interactions with the world. And as a result, folks are not equally positioned. The variation in people's capacity to manage their own frustration, to regulate their attention, to sustain cognitive effort, and interpret feedback, all of that is biological. So we're going to break this down and we're going to talk about stress first. We know that environmental conditions influence the development of our neural systems, and studies on chronic stress show that prolonged activation of stress hormones like cortisol can alter the structure and the functioning of the brain regions involved in executive control. I'm stressed, so now I make bad decisions, and then I'm gonna get more stressed and then make more bad decisions. It's like the opposite of the hedonic treadmill. When stress responses are triggered repeatedly over time, the body accumulates what is called allostatic load, a physiological burden that affects both your physical health and your cognitive functioning. High allostatic load can impair your working memory, your attentional control, and make learning tasks more difficult. Sleep is another one here. It dramatically influences our cognitive capacity. There's an incredible amount of research on the relationship between the quality of sleep and ADHD, anxiety and depression, eating disorders, dementia, PTSD, grief and trauma. The list does in fact go on. On one side, you have institutional schedules, and on the other side, you have biological rhythms. And these two... The next part of this conversation about norms is talking about neurodivergent brains. I do want to take a side quest here. We're going to take a side quest. You may have heard or used the term neurospicy. I don't like when people use the term neurospicy because it turns something real and structural into something cute and consumable. It dilutes the meaning of something that can permanently affect how people move through their lives. And there is a pattern where marginalized or stigmatized identities get rebranded into something that's cute, so it's easier for other people to accept, but that often benefits the audience more than the people being described. Like, imagine if we as a culture started calling people with diabetes. Come on, diabetes? Like, I know that's almost a drag queen name, and that's the only context of which we would use it in would be for a satirical drag queen name, not actually referring to a patient as a diabetes if I'm a doctor or a nurse. It's a different context. Now let's forget about neurospicy and actually talk about neurodivergence. It was a concept that was first articulated by sociologist Judy Singer, and it reframes the differences in our brains as natural variations within human cognition rather than deficits that have to be corrected. And diversity in cognitive styles is expected rather than exceptional. Some people regulate attention through movement, and some people regulate their attention through complete silence. And the only way to discern the difference is by giving each individual the chance to experience everything and equipping them with the knowledge and the tools to relay their experience in a meaningful way. You cannot standardize everything. And this is where we land at accommodation, because most of the available support in schools is presented as a matter of accommodation, which is individualized programs after difficulties rise. And these measures are valuable. They are invaluable. They're important. But they treat neurological differences as an exception to a standard model of learning. And a different approach would recognize variation in cognitive functioning as a starting condition rather than an anomaly. Because once you have a classroom full of anomalies, the word doesn't mean anything anymore. 13 IPPs. I want to take all of this one step further because I just learned about a paper that talks about the weirdest people in the world. And it argues that the strong majority of research in human psychology and behavior is drawn from samples entirely from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. Not only that, of those people in the weird societies who most frequently participate in the studies are undergraduate students, another subset of a single population that is broadly applied to all human beings as if it was representative of the species as any other population would be. And we're going to get into that right away. So to finish off this chapter here, when we assume neurological uniformity, people who diverge from that assumption appear to be the problem. The variation does not lie in the willingness that somebody has to interact with their world, but in the interaction between a diverse brain and the structure that we place around them. Chapter 2, Celebrated Eccentricity and Punished Deviation. So if you are weird, meaning Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, your quirks are generally seen as genius, eccentric, visionary. But if you're not Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, suddenly those traits become weird, unprofessional, or something else that needs to be fixed. Essentially, it's not about the behavior, it's about who is allowed to have that behavior. And that allowance is malleable. The exact same traits get translated completely differently depending on who's performing them and where. If a CEO works through the night, forgets to eat, and disappears into an idea, they're a visionary. But a student who can't shift their attention and misses deadlines in a classroom has poor time management. An artist who only speaks in metaphors, jumps between their thoughts, and resists structure. Wow, they must be brilliant. But a kid in a classroom does that and they're off task and need redirection. A billionaire who wears the same suit every day. Efficient. A teenager does it. Weird. A famous author disappears for weeks. Dedicated. I isolate. Concerning. A wealthy investor who takes risks with their money. They're strategic. But a working class person does the same thing. They're reckless. It's funny how risk becomes brilliance when failure is cushioned. It's funny how eccentricity becomes innovation when the rent is already paid. We don't celebrate our differences. We authorize it because when somebody is already successful, we often narrate ourselves backwards. We take every trait, every interruption, every obsession, every social misstep, and we polish it until it looks like destiny. But when someone isn't successful yet, we diagnose, we correct, we discipline, we shrink them until they fit a version of functional that never made room for them in the first place. A kid who talks too much is a man who commands the room, but only if he survives long enough without being silenced first. A student who can't sit still becomes dynamic, energetic, but only if the system doesn't break them before the rebrand. And most people don't survive the rebrand through wealth or status or somebody willing to call them a genius before the world calls them a problem. There's actually a whole body of research in sociology that looks through something called labeling theory. Behaviors don't carry meaning on their own, but meaning gets assigned to them by their social context. And once a behavior is labeled, that label sticks. And it starts shaping how people interpret everything else you do. So if you're labeled gifted, your quirks get absorbed into that narrative. If you're labeled difficult, those same quirks become evidence of your defiance. And once that label lands, it's real sticky. There's also another concept here from cultural anthropology called norm reinforcement, which basically describes how groups maintain cohesion by subtly or not so subtly correcting people who step outside expected behavior. Sometimes that correction is gentle, like a weird look or laugh or what are you doing? But other times it's more formal, discipline, exclusion, performance reviews, grades. There's a lot of consequences that can happen. And then we look at the ones who made it through, the billionaires, the founders, the artists, and we say, see, we celebrate diversity. No. We celebrate survivorship. A lot of people can deviate quite far before people say anything, but others get flagged immediately. And the difference is often tied to power and how closely somebody already aligns with what the system considers normal. So if you already fit the mold, you're perceived as competent, articulate, maybe attractive, maybe white, maybe male, maybe economically secure. Your deviations in this context get interpreted as intentional, as a style, as your personality. And this is where we start to dip into social conditioning and even some operant conditioning. Behaviors that are rewarded get repeated. Behaviors that are punished, even just subtly so, get suppressed. So if your version of weird gets negative feedback early and often, you don't stop being that way, you just start editing yourself. And what's wild to me is that suppression is often reframed as maturity. How insulting is that? Meanwhile, the people whose weird aligns with what the system rewards, they get to double down. They get more confident, more expressive, more experimental because their deviations are being reinforced as a strength. This is why certain forms of eccentricity become very marketable. Think about the archetype of the genius. It's almost always somebody who's out there breaking the rules, but in a very specific, culturally appropriate way. They're messy, but not too messy. They're intense, but in a way that produces something valuable. Their weirdness is framed as productive, and that's the key. And this is where modern education gets the little side eye from me, because schools often function as early sorting systems for this exact dynamic. And this mindset follows people into their workplaces, their relationships, their creative spaces, everywhere. It's everywhere. It's everything. We are talking about a social filter that determines whether deviation gets turned into capital or correction. The alliteration lines always hit so good. If the system only celebrates weirdness when it comes from certain people in certain forms under certain conditions, then that's actually not celebrating differences. It's selecting for it. Stop gaslighting me. To understand more about this, we're going to get into the last chapter. We're going to go back in time to where this all begins, and that's on the playground. Chapter 3, play as a protective factor. The idea of play, playing in a sandbox, playing on the playground, is often filtered through the same social lens that decides whose behavior is visionary and whose is disruptive from the last chapter. And in reality, play is protective, and like most protective factors, access to it is uneven. Developmental research has long established that play is central to cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, and social development. See my episode on play. But here's where we get more into the social filter. When a child from a privileged background spends hours building imaginary worlds, they are seen as gifted. When a child from a marginalized background engages in the same behavior, particularly in structured environments like classrooms, it is more likely to be labeled as distraction, avoidance, and defiance. The behavior itself does not change, but the outcome does. It becomes safer for some children to take risks, get messy, make mistakes, miss frizzle, I don't know the line. Over time, the differential response shapes a person's behavior and identity, and people learn quickly whether their curiosity is welcome. When children have access to psychologically safe play, they are buffered against stress and adversity. Play allows for emotional processing, offering a space to make sense of experiences that may otherwise be overwhelming. It supports self-regulation by providing repeated low-stakes opportunity to navigate frustration, negotiate social dynamics, and recover from mistakes. So in neurobiological terms, play helps calibrate our stress response systems, reducing long-term vulnerability to anxiety and depression. It all starts with play. But when access to play is restricted through anything, over-disciplining, rigid schooling structures, inequitable social expectations, all of these protective benefits disappear. And that has really big implications. Because the same traits that are cultivated through play, like divergent thinking and persistence, are later recorded as markers of innovation and leadership in adulthood. Yet the children most likely to have those traits nurtured are also those least likely to be penalized for expressing those traits early in their lives. So we're not out here rewarding creativity, we are permitting creativity. And that is the paradox right in the middle of equity for me. If play is protective, then inequitable access to play is not a minor developmental issue, it's a structural one. Because by the time we encounter these individuals as adults, their narrative has already been written. One is naturally creative, the other struggles with focus. This one is innovative. Think about the last few people you've met. Can you pull any key takeaways from their personality? Like, do you have any mental markers of like, this is Brian, and Brian is loud? I feel like when people would meet me for not a long time, they'd be like, this is David. David is crazy. There's usually a word or two that becomes most memorable about a person, especially in the early phases of meeting them. I wonder if those self-beliefs were given to us naturally, or if they were assigned to us at a certain age and we just continued it. Something to think about. So to wrap up this episode, if there is a single thread that is running through the entire thing, it is this. We have been mistaking design for normal. From the very beginning of this conversation, we saw what gets labeled as weird is often just a violation of an invisible rule. Not a real problem or a deficit, just a mismatch between the person and an expectation that was never made explicit. Then in chapter 1, we talked about how these expectations themselves are not neutral. They're built on neurological assumptions, and they're assumptions that ignore the reality that no two brains arrive at the starting line the same way. In chapter 2, we talk about what happens next when those assumptions don't just quietly sit in the background, they become filters, where the same behavior gets translated differently depending on the context, where eccentricity becomes genius for some and a problem for others. And in chapter 3, we talked about play and how that's where it all begins. All of these pieces together that we've discussed so far, none of it is accidental. It's not a series of small misunderstandings. It's not just some people fall through the cracks. It's the predictable outcome of a system designed around a narrow version about how human beings should look and act and think. And when you design for a narrow user, everyone else becomes a problem, not because they are a problem, but because the system has no language for them other than fix this. So in this model, sometimes we accommodate, we support after the fact, but accommodation, as important as it is, still assumes the system was correct to begin with. What if normal was never a description, but rather a decision? Because every design is always a decision. Every classroom routine, every expectation about behavior, every definition of participation, these are not natural laws, they are choices. And those choices determine who gets to feel competent, who gets to feel creative, and who feels like they belong. So when I talk about designing for equity, I'm not trying to just make things easier for everybody. That seems to be something that people assume. But then I think we're getting into like DEI, equity, transgender aliens. I'm not talking about making things easier. I'm talking about making things truer to how human beings actually function. Design that assumes attention fluctuations. Design that makes room for movement. Design that treats curiosity as a starting point. Design that allows multiple ways of engaging, expressing, and understanding. Because the goal is not to eliminate all of our differences. The goal is to stop punishing it. And once we start designing environments that expect variation from the beginning, something really cool happens. Weird starts to disappear. Not because everybody becomes normal, but because the system becomes less narrow. And suddenly, the kid who couldn't sit still is no longer a problem to solve. The student who jumps between ideas is no longer off task. The person who approaches the world differently isn't a problem to fix. They are just accounted for. So the next time you hear somebody use the word weird earnestly to describe the behavior of somebody, I want you to pause, because it might not be describing a person at all. It might be pointing to the edge of a system that was never designed with that person in mind. And if that's the case, then the work of equity is not to help people fit within that system, it is to redesign it so fewer people have to shrink just to survive it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one real soon. Bye. Bye, weirdos. But if you're all weirdos, then nobody's weirdos. Okay. Well, this take went much better. It involved no crying. Oh, man. I need to delete that old footage. Good God. Okay, now goodbye.